Part 5th. Further verifications based upon the peculiarities of a polar paradise. When the sun of the east forgets, when the star no longer sets, when the sacred rishis 7 wheel all night in highest heaven, when the sky descending sea waters but a single tree, when each year is but a day, what shall all those portents say? Chapter 1. The Eden Stars. I vidi stelle non viste mai, forse alla prima gente. Dante. We have already reminded the reader that in an Eden situated at the North Pole, the stars, instead of seeming to rise and set as with us, would have had a horizontal motion from left to right, round and round the observer. This appearance of the heavenly bodies could of course be found nowhere but at the pole. If, therefore, we could anywhere in the world of ancient tradition find any statement of a belief that at the beginning of the world the movements of the heavenly bodies were different from their present movements, and particularly if we should be able to find trace of a belief that the primeval motion of the stars was in orbits apparently horizontal, this would certainly be a most striking and cogent and unexpected evidence that human observation of the starry heavens began at the pole. Now it so happens that we have traces of just such a belief. In the tantalizing fragments of ancient lore, preserved to us in the pages of Diogenes Laertius, we find ascribed to the illustrious Greek astronomer Anaxagoras this remarkable teaching. In the beginning, the stars revolved in a tholiform manner. Now, to revolve in a tholiform manner is to revolve in a horizontal plane, like the tholos, or dome, of an astronomical observatory. Anaxagoras himself defined the motion more fully when he said that it was a motion, not upo, underneath, but peri, around the earth. Anaximenes would seem to have had the same idea, for he is reported to have likened the primitive revolution of the sky to the rotating of a man's hat upon his head. Another explanatory expression, whether originating with Anaxagoras or with his reporter we do not know, is this. At first, the pole star, which is continually visible, always appeared in the zenith, but afterward it appeared in a certain declination. Here, then, we have a doctrine of the ancient astronomers, the singular notion that, in the beginning of the world, the celestial pole was in the zenith, and that the revolutions of the stars were round a perpendicular axis. What could have led an astronomer to invent such a doctrine, it is impossible to say. On the other hand, if it was one of the interesting and seemingly paradoxical traditions of the early post-Diluvian world, it is perfectly easy to see how imperishable a story it would be, particularly among the star-loving Chaldeans and Babylonians, from whom the earliest Greek astronomers and scientists received no small share of their doctrines. And that the Chaldeans and probably the Egyptians had precisely this idea is not a notion here advanced for the first time. Another interesting question now suggests itself. When and under what circumstances was this alleged declination of the pole imagined to have taken place? Was it gradual or sudden? Did the ancients suppose it to have resulted from a movement in the regular order of nature, or from one in violation thereof? Was it to them a normal and ever-ongoing change, or was it the record of natural catastrophe? Our hypothesis would lead us to expect the latter of these suppositions. The only rational and credible explanation of the declination is to be found in a transfer of the theater of human history from the circumpolar home to some land of lower latitude. Now if, during the prevalence of the deluge, or later, in consequence of the oncoming of the Ice Age, the survivors of the flood were translocated from their antediluvian home at the pole to the north slope of the plateau of Pamir, the probable starting point of historic post-Diluvian humanity, the new aspect presented by the heavens in this new latitude would have been precisely as if, in the grand world convulsion, the sky itself had become displaced, its polar dome tilted over about 1/3 of the distance from the zenith to the horizon. The astronomical knowledge of those survivors very likely enabled them to understand the true reason of the changed appearance, but their rude descendants, unfavored with the treasures of antediluvian science, and born only to a savage or nomadic life in their new and inhospitable home, might easily have forgotten the explanation. In time, such children's children might easily have come to embody the strange story handed down from their fathers in strange myths, in which nothing of the original facts remained beyond an obscure amount of some mysterious displacement of the sky, supposed to have occurred in a far-off age in connection with some appalling natural cataclysm or world disaster. Now it is difficult to believe it a mere accident that in various ancient authors we find allusion both to an extremely ancient displacement of the sky and to its supposed original state. None of these allusions have ever been explained by writers on the subject. One of them occurs in Plato's Timaeus, where, in language ascribed to an Egyptian priest of Solon's time, a declination of the bodies revolving round the earth is spoken of, and this declination is offered as the true explanation of the partial destruction of the world commemorated in the myth of Phaethon. As this destruction was by fire, there would at first sight seem to be no connection between it and the destruction at the time of the deluge, nor is there in the context anything to suggest such a connection. Fortunately, however, we have in Hyginus a fuller version of the myth, from which it appears that the Greeks supposed Deucalion's universal flood to have been providentially sent to extinguish the fearful conflagration which Phaethon's unskillful driving of the steeds of the sun had occasioned. This makes the connection clear and direct. The flood and the declination of the heavenly bodies revolving around the earth are at once brought into a true historic relation. In like manner, in the Bundahish, in the first 5 chapters, and in Zad Sapram's paraphrase of the same, it is stated that during the first 3,000 years, before the incoming of the Evil One, the sun, moon, and stars still stood still. But as soon as the destroyer of the good creation came, he assaulted and deranged the sky, as well as the earth and sea. And remarkably enough, it is stated that as a result of this assault, the Evil One mastered as much as 1/3 of the sky, and overspread it with darkness. Moreover, in the 30th chapter, and giving a prophetic account of the final restoration of the material world to its primeval state, there seems to be an allusion in verse 32 to a necessary resetting or readjustment of the celestial vault by the hand of its creator. To all such facts, wherever found, we have in the hypothesis of an Arctic Eden and a transfer of the human horizon at the time of the deluge to lower latitudes at perfect key. Chapter 2. The Eden Day. Such day as heaven's great year brings forth. Milton. To the first men, if the Garden of Eden was located at the pole, there could have been but 1 day and 1 night in a year. Moreover, at the break of that strange day, the sun might have risen, not in the east, as in post-diluvian times, but in the south. Do the traditions or sacred books of the ancient world afford any hint of such a sunrise and of such an Eden day? A partial answer to this question is found in the beliefs of the ancient Northmen. A learned Danish writer pronounces it remarkable that the Scandinavian mythology informs us that, before the establishment of the present order of the world, the sun, which now rises in the east, rose in the south. Equally striking confirmations appear in other mythologies. Turning to the second Fargard of the Avesta, we find the most ancient Iranian account of Yima, the first man and the king of the Golden Age. A detailed account is also given of a certain Vara, or enclosure, which, as a safe habitation, a kind of Garden of Eden, he has divinely commanded to make. Then comes the singular question and answer. O maker of the material world, thou Holy One, what lights are there in Vara which Yima made? Ahura Mazda answered, There are uncreated lights and created lights. There are stars, the moon, and the sun are the only one a year seen to rise and set, and a year seems only as a day. Haug's version of the last clause is, and they think that a day which is a year. Spiegel's is the same, although in his commentary he confesses himself perplexed as to the meaning of so remarkable a declaration. The really genuine words, he observes, are very difficult. They are not so when once the key is found. That the East Aryans had the same idea is also evident from the laws of Manu. Among this people, Yama, the same as the Iranian Yima, was the first man. His first abode, as we have seen, was at the North Pole, and at death he became a god. the guardian of the South Pole, at which was the region of the dead. But though the Hindus no longer associated him with the North at the time of the writing of this ancient book, they well understood that Yama's primitive Eden in Ilavrita and around the North Polar Meru, where the gods reside, has only 1 day and 1 night in the year. This is the language of the code. A year of mortals is a day and a night of the gods, or regents of the universe seated around the North Pole. And again, their division is this. Their day is the northern and their night the southern course of the sun. In like manner, in the Surya Siddhanta we read, "The gods behold the sun, after it is once arisen for half a year." Equally unmistakable is the language of the probably more ancient work, lately translated under the title of the Institutes of Vishnu. The northern progress of the sun is a day with the gods. The southern progress of the sun is with them a night. A year is with them a day and a night. This strange notion is perfectly clear and comprehensible the moment we assume that the long-lived fathers of the first regents of the human race originally dwelt at the North Pole, and that these, apotheosized and glorified in the imagination of later generations, in time became the gods which ancient nations worshipped. Both in the Iliad and Odyssey, we learned Anton Krischenbauer finds 2 kinds of days continually referred to. In what he considers the more ancient portions of the poems, the day is a period of 1 year's duration, especially when used in describing the life and exploits of the gods. In what he considers the more modern portions, the term has its modern meaning as a period of 24 hours. He quotes Lepsius as recognizing a similar 1-day year in the Egyptian and other ancient chronologies, and the mention of it is made by Palafatos and Suidas. In all such hitherto unnoticed testimonies, and we have not exhausted the list of them, we have new and singularly unimpeachable evidences that in the thought of these ancient peoples, the land in which the generated gods and men alike originated was a land in which, as in our Pole Eden, a day and a night filled out the year. And if such was their idea, whence, say from actual tradition, they could have derived it. As cautious a scientific authority as Sir Charles Lyell, speaking of these cosmological and chronological traditions of the Hindus, says, "We can by no means look upon them as a pure effort of the unassisted imagination, or believe them to have been composed without regard to opinions and theories founded on the observation of nature." Even where the tradition has become distorted or inverted among barbarians, the parallelism of the year and the day is not always lost. A curious instance of this has come under the notice of the writer since the present chapter was begun. In those days, in the world before the present, the seasons were much shorter than they are now. A year then was but a day of our time. Chapter 3. The Eden Zenith. The shrine where motion first began, and light and life in mingling torrent ran, from whence each bright rotundity was hurled, the throne of God, the center of the world. Campbell's Pleasures of Hope. El walketh in the chug of heaven. Book of Job. To the first men, on the hypothesis of an Arctic Eden, the zenith and the north pole of the heavens were identical. Such an aspect of the starry vault of the humanity of our late historic ages has never seen. Under such an adjustment of the rotating firmament, how regular an orderly world nature appear! What profound significance would of necessity attach to the mysterious unmoving center point of cosmic revolution directly overhead? As intimated on page 50, that polar center must naturally have seemed to be the top of the world, the true heaven, and changeless seat of the supreme god or gods. And if, through all the lifelong time of the antediluvian world, this circumpolar sky was thus to human thought the true abode of God, the oldest post-diluvian peoples, though scattered down the sides of the globe half or 2/3 the distance of the equator, could not easily forget that at the center and true top of the firmament was the throne and palace of its great creator. The religions of all ancient nations signally confirm and satisfy this antecedent expectation. With a marvelous unanimity, they associate the abode of the supreme God with the North Pole, the center of heaven, or with the celestial space immediately surrounding it. No writer on comparative theology has ever brought out the facts which establish this assertion, but the following outline of them will suffice for our present purpose. First, the Hebrew conception. In so pure and lofty a monotheism as that of the ancient Hebrews, we must not expect to find any such strict localization of the supreme God in the circumpolar sky as we shall find among polytheistic peoples. "Do I not fill heaven and earth?" is the language of Jehovah. Nevertheless, as the Hebrews must be supposed to have shared, in some measure, the geographical and cosmological ideas of their age, it would not be strange if, in their sacred writings, traces of these ideas were here and there discernible. Some of these traces are quite curious, and they have attracted the attention of not a few biblical scholars, to whom their origin and rationale are entirely unsuspected. Thus, a learned writer on Hebrew geography, after blindly repeating the common assumption that the Hebrews convinced the surface of the earth to be an immense disk, supported, like the flat roof of an eastern house, by pillars, yet uses such language as this: "The north appears to have been regarded as the highest part of the earth's surface, in consequence, perhaps, of the mountain ranges which existed there." Another, touching upon the same subject, says, "The Hebrews regarded what lay to the north as higher, and what lay to the south as lower. Hence they who traveled from south to north were said to go up, while they who went from north to south were said to go down." In Psalm 75, verse 6, we read, "Promotion cometh not from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south." Why this singular enumeration of the 3 points of the compass, and this omission of the 4th? Simply because heaven, the proper abode of the supreme God, being conceived of by all the surrounding nations, if not by the Hebrews themselves, as in the north, in the circumpolar sky, that was the sacred quarter, and it could not reverently be said that the promotion cometh not from the north. It would have been an offensive as among us to say that promotion cometh not from above. Therefore, having completed his negative statements, the psalmist immediately adds, "But God is the judge. He putteth down one, and setteth up another." A curious trace of the same conception appears in the book of Job, in the 8th and 9th verses of the 23rd chapter. In Old Testament times, the Hebrews and the Arabians designated the cardinal points by the personal terms before for east, behind for west, left hand for north, and right hand for south. Thus Job, in the passage indicated, is complaining that he can nowhere, east or west, north or south, find his divine judge. But in speaking of one of these points, he adds the singular qualification, "where God doth work." This is said of the left hand, or north. It seems to be inserted to render peculiarly emphatic the declaration, "I go even to the left hand where he doth work, but I cannot behold him." If at first blush such an apparent localizing of the divine agency seems inconsistent with Job's splendid descriptions of God's omnipresence in other passages, it should be remembered that we, too, speak of the omnipresent deity as dwelling on high, and address him as "Our Father which art in heaven." A natural counterpart to this idea of a northern heaven would be a belief or impression that spiritual perils and evils were in a peculiar degree or manner to be apprehended from the right hand, or south, as the proper abode of demons, the quarter to which Asmodeus fled when exorcised by the angel. We cannot positively affirm that such a belief consciously prevailed among the ancient Hebrews, but, holding the possibility in mind, we find passages of Scripture which seem to stand out in a new and striking light. Thus, in case there was such a belief, how great the force and beauty of the expression, "Because the Lord is at my right hand, the side exposed to danger, I shall not be moved." With this may be compared the confident expressions of the 121st Psalm, "The Lord is thy keeper, the Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand." So also in the 91st is it on the right hand that destruction is anticipated. "1,000 shall fall at thy side, and, or even 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee." Again, in the 142nd, it is said, "I look on my right hand, but there is no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cares for my soul." Notice all the imprecation, "Let Satan stand at his right hand." And in the vision of Zechariah, where the great adversary makes his appearance on the right of the one whom he came to resist. But as Satan here reveals himself from beneath and from the south, so to Ezekiel the true God reveals himself from above and from the north. In that quarter was God's holy mountain, the city of the great king, the land of gold, the place where divine power had hung the earth upon nothing. Hence, the priests officiating at the altar, both in the tabernacle and later in the temple, faced the north. According to the Talmud, King David had an Aeolian harp in the north window of his royal bedchamber, by means of which the north wind woke him every night at midnight for prayer and pious meditations. Probably it is not without significance that in Ezekiel's vision of the ideal temple of the future, the chamber prepared for the priests in charge of the altar was one whose prospect was towards the north. Second, the Egyptian conception. The correspondence of the ancient Egyptian conception of the world and the heaven with the foregoing would be remarkable, did we not know that Egypt was the cradle of the Hebrew people. The ancient inhabitants of the Nile Valley had the same idea as to the direction of the true summit of the earth. To them, as to the Hebrews, it was in the north. This was the more remarkable since it was exactly contrary to all the natural indications of their own country, which continually ascended toward the south. As stated in a previous chapter, Brugsch says, "The Egyptians conceived of the earth as rising toward the north, so that in its northernmost point it is joined to the sky." In correspondence herewith, the Egyptians located their Ta-Natur, or land of the gods, in the extreme north. On this account, it is on the northern exterior wall of the great temple of Ammon at Karnak that the divinity promises to King Ramses II the products of that heavenly country, silver, gold, lapis lazuli, and all the varieties of precious stones of the land of the gods. Hence also, contrary to all natural indications, the northern hemisphere was considered the realm of light, the southern the realm of darkness. The passage out of the secret chambers of the Great Pyramid was pointed precisely at the north pole of the heavens. All the other pyramids had their openings only on the northern side. That this arrangement had some religious significance few students of the subject have ever doubted. And if our interpretation is correct, such passages from the burial chamber toward the polar heaven intimated a vital faith that from the chamber of death to the highest abode of life, imperishable and divine, the road is straight and ever open. Third, the conception of the Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Indians, and Iranians. After what has been said in former chapters respecting the location of Karsakura, Sadmahati, Harmod, Sumeru, and Haraberizati, no further proof is needed that all the peoples above named associated the true heaven, the abode of the highest gods, with the northern celestial pole. In each case, the apex of the respective mounts of the gods pierced the sky precisely at that point. To this day, the Haranite Sabians, the most direct heirs of the religious traditions of the Tigro-Euphratean world, construct their temples with careful reference to the ancient faith. Their priests also, in the act of sacrifice, like all ancient priesthoods, face the north. In the Rig Veda 2.41, we read of the Amartasaya Nabahim, the navel of the heavens. The same or similar expressions occur again and again in Vedic literature. They refer to the northern celestial pole, just as the expression Nabhir Prithivayas, navel of the earth, and elsewhere signifies the northern terrestrial pole. To each is ascribed preeminent sanctity. The one is the holiest shrine in heaven, the other the holiest shrine on earth. That no translator has hitherto caught the true meaning of the terms seems unaccountable. In Buddhism, the heir and conservator of so many of the ancient ideas of India, the same notion of a world ruler with his throne in the celestial pole lived on. Very curiously, if we follow the authority of the Latavasrastra, the first actions of the words ascribed to the infant Buddha on his arrival in our world unmistakably identify the north with the abode of the gods, and its nadir with the abode of the demons. Even the modern relics in non-Aryan aboriginal tribes of India, as for example the Gonds, have retained this ancient ecumenical ethnic belief. Fourth, the Phoenician, Greek, Etruscan, and Roman conception. That the Phoenicians shared the general Asiatic view of a mountain of the gods in the extreme north appears from Movers' learned work upon that people. The evidence that in ancient Hellenic thought, also, the heaven of the gods was in the northern sky is incidental, but cumulative and satisfactory. For example, heaven is upheld by Atlas, but the terrestrial station of Atlas, as we have elsewhere shown, is at the North Pole. Again, Olympos was the abode of the gods, but if the now generally current etymology of this current term is correct, Olympos was simply the Atlantean pillar, pictured as a lofty mountain and supporting the sky at its northern pole. In fact, many writers now affirm that the Olympos of Greek mythology was originally simply the North Polar world mountain of the Asiatic nations. In prayer, the Greeks turned towards the north, and from Homer we know that when they addressed the Olympian gods, they stretched out their hands toward the starry heavens. Greek prayers, therefore, must have been addressed towards the northern heavens. Entirely confirmatory of this is the account Plato gives of the holy habitation of Zeus, in which the solemn convocations of the gods were held, and which, he explains, was placed in the center of the world. That this center is the northern celestial pole is placed beyond question by a well-known passage from Servius Marinus, where it is called the Domicilium Fovis, and where we are informed that the Etruscan and Roman augurs considered thunder and lightning in the northern sky more significant than in any other quarter, being higher and nearer to the abode of love. Countries in the high northern latitudes shared this peculiar sanctity. Toward the end of the official of state paganism, says Monsieur Beauvoir, the Romans regarded Great Britain as nearer heaven and more sacred than the Mediterranean countries. Varro and other Latin writers confirm this general representation, so that all modern expounders of the old Etruscan religion unite in locating the abode of the gods of Etruria in the center of heaven, the northern circumpolar sky. Niebuhr and other authorities of the highest rank assure us that the Romans shared the same faith. Fifth, the Japanese conception. We have already seen that in the Japanese cosmogony, the down-thrust spear of Izanagi becomes the upright axis of heaven and earth. Izanagi's place, therefore, at the upper end of this axis can be nowhere else than at the north pole of the sky. But we are not left to inference. So inseparably was the creator associated with the pole in ancient Japanese thought that one of his loftiest and divinest titles was derived from this association. Writing of the primitive ideas of this people, one of our best authorities uses the following language. I shall do the Kojiki and the Shinto religion and the Japanese philosophy strict justice by saying that, according to them, there existed in the beginning one God, and nobody and nothing besides. Far in the deep infinitudes of space, upon a throne of silence, sat the god Amino Minaka Nushui no Kami, whose name signifies the Lord of the Center of Heaven. What the center of heaven is cannot well be doubtful to any careful reader of the present chapter. Sixth, the Chinese conception. The oldest traceable worship among the Chinese is that of Shangte, the highest of all gods. It is believed to have existed more than 2,000 years before Christ. Shangte is usually and correctly described as the god of heaven, but his power place of abode, his palace, is called Cuiwei. And if we inquire as to the meaning and location of Cuiwei, the native commentators upon the sacred books inform us that a celestial space about the North Pole. Here, as in Japan, and in Egypt, and in India, and in Iran, and in Greece, the pole is the center of the sky. A writer in the Chinese repository quotes from authoritative religious books these declarations. The polar star is the center of heaven. Shangte's throne is Cuiwei, i.e. the polar star. Immediately over the central peak of Qianlun appears the polar star, which is Shangte's heavenly abode. In the central place, the polar star of heaven, the bright one, the great monad, always dwells. In accordance with this conception, the emperor and his assistants, when officiating before the altar of heaven, always faces the north. The pole star itself is a prominent object of worship, and how prevalent this location of the abode of God at the pole remains after 4,000 years may be illustrated by the following incident narrated by Reverend Dr. E. Atkins. I met on one occasion a schoolmaster from the neighborhood of Chapu. He asked if I had any books to give away on astronomy and geography. Such books are eagerly desired by all members of the literary class. The inquiry was put to him, "Who is the Lord of heaven and earth?" He replied that he knew none but the pole star, called in the Chinese language Tianhuang Te, the great imperial ruler of heaven. Seventh, the ancient German and the Finnic conception. Like the ancients, when praying and sacrificing to the gods, the pagan Germans turned their faces toward the north. There, in the northern heaven, at the top of Yggdrasil, the world axis, stood the fair city of Asgard, the home of the Asin. The Eddas expressly say that it was built in the center of the world. At that point, whence alone the world of men is ever visible by night and day, stood Hildskjalf, the watchtower of Odin. From this partie septentrionale du ciel, he and Frigga, like the great gods of the Etruscans, veillaient sur toute la terre. Among the ancient Finns, the name of the supreme god was Ukko. In their mythology, he is sometimes represented as upbearding the firmament, like Atlas, and sometimes he is called Taivahan Napanan, the navel of heaven. As Castren shows, this curious title is given him simply because he resides in the center or pole of heaven. In the great epic of this people, the Kalevala, the abode of the supreme god is called Tatela, which word simply means place of Tati, Estonian Tat, the polar star. We have not exhausted our materials in hand for the illustration of this point, but surely we have presented enough. Reviewing the singular unanimity of the ancient nations, no thoughtful reader can fail to be impressed with its significance. No other explanation of it can be so simple and obvious as the supposition that the heaven which overarched the cradle of humanity was a heaven whose zenith was the northern pole. Before concluding the present chapter, another point of considerable interest should be noticed. In reading the Edenic traditions of the ancient nations, as given in Part 4th, the question may well have suggested itself to the reader. How is it that, with such perfect unanimity of the part of contemporary nations in respect to the north polar position of the cradle of mankind, the traditions of the Hebrews alone should have placed it in the east? In the facts just now reviewed, we have a key to this puzzle. The only word in Genesis which connects Eden with the east as kedem. This term properly means that which is before or in front of a person, and was applied to the east from the custom of turning in that direction when describing the points of the compass. From Genesis chapter 13, verse 14, it would seem to have acquired this association with the east as early as the days of Abraham. But according to the custom of a particular time or people, it could mean one point of the compass as well as another. It was simply the front country. In late historic times among the Hebrews it was the east, and accordingly the west was the country behind the north and left hand of the south the right, as before noticed. In Egypt, however, the usage was different, the front country being either the north or the south, which we cannot certainly tell, as Egyptologists are divided on the question. Pierret thinks that it was the south, and that accordingly the right hand was west and the left east. Chabas and others, however, exactly reverse the meaning of the hieroglyphics translated right and left, and hold that they're designating the points of the compass the ancient Egyptians faced the north. Among the Akkadians and Assyrians, if we may rely upon a questionable statement of Lenormand, still another adjustment prevailed. The right hand was the north, the left the south, and the front direction, of course, the west. In view of these facts, it is plain that, anterior to the fixation of Hebrew usage, that in pre-Abrahamic times, Kedem, or the front country, may as well have meant the north as any other quarter. And there is much reason to suppose that it did have this meaning. We have seen that this was peculiarly the sacred quarter of the whole Asiatic and Egyptian world. Toward it faced all earliest priesthoods and worshippers of whom we have any knowledge. What so natural as they should contemplate and designate the different quarters of the world from the standpoint of their normal posture and worship? And if once we assume that such was the usage of all the Noachidae anterior to their dispersion, and accordingly the front country meant the north, all at once becomes plain. Genesis then unites with universal ethnic tradition in locating the cradle of mankind in the north. The record then reads, "And the Lord God planted a garden in the north country, in Eden, and in precise agreement herewith it is drawn from the mountainous heights of the north country, from Kedem, that the descendants of Noah in after time come into the plain and the land of Shinar." So is cleared up simultaneously another mystery, for how to bring the first colonizers of Shinar into the Tigro-Euphrates Valley from any probable Ararat by any probable journeying from the east, or, as the margin gives it, eastwards, has always perplexed the commentator. This interpretation harmonizes for the first time Genesis chapter 2 verse 8 with Ezekiel chapter 28 verse 13, both now referring to one and the same point of the compass, the sacred north. Again, the well-known difficulty of harmonizing the references to the children of Kedem, found in the oldest of the Hebrew scriptures, such as Genesis chapter 29 verse 1 and Job chapter 1 verse 3, is solved at once by this interpretation. At the same time, it gives us a location for the land of Uz, exactly corresponding with the explicit declaration of Josephus. Uz founded Tacotonis in Damascus. This country lies between Palestine and Coelesyria. To most readers, this solution of the problem of the exceptional character of the Hebrew tradition will probably at once commend itself as eminently satisfactory. To some, however, it may seem a little difficult of belief that one and the same term could in successive ages have found application to different points of the compass. To such the following, written of course, with no reference to our problem, will be of special interest. The names of the 4 cardinal points, and, what is very remarkable, the hieroglyphic signs by which they are expressed, are in a certain measure the same in the Akkadian and Chinese cultures. This I intend to show in a special monograph upon the subject, but that which is here of importance to note is the displacement of the geographical horizon produced in the establishing of the 100 famines. The south, which was so termed on the cuneiform tablets, corresponds in Chinese to the east, the north to the west, the east to the south, making thus a displacement of a quarter of a circle. It would be interesting if, on examination of the Akkadian and Assyrian names, we could find that they, in their turn, denoted an early displacement of which only these traces remain to us. Possibly the usage of ancient Egypt may enable us to put our solution in yet simpler form. If we may accept the teachings of the learned Maspero, the Egyptians often reduced the 4 quarters or directions to 2, using the term east in a sense sufficiently broad to include both east and north, and the term west in a sense sufficiently broad to include both west and south. If then, Moses, who in his education was an Egyptian, wrote in accordance with such a usage, it would be quite possible to use Kedem for a front country in the north, and again, without embarrassment, to use the same term in speaking of the east.